Taking a deep breath in. We breathe in peace. We exhale love. Once again, honoring that whatever happened during the day no longer exists. What's going to happen after this moment also does not exist. And all that is right here now, here in this beautiful moment. Deep breath. And here we are. So for those of you just joining in on YouTube, we just listened to All Kinds of Kinds by Miranda Lambert. So you're welcome to go back and listen to that or watch that music video. It's quite beautiful. Because today's topic is Ignorance is an Illusion. We seek understanding, from my book, Living Peace, which is Tenet 4. And I'm going to start today's sermon by sharing an excerpt from the book. I have it written down on your little handout. And for those of you that might be reading, following along at home, it's pages 92 to 93. So, I teach my students to think beyond duality, opinions, and taking sides. We must always be open and willing to shift our perceptions. The moment we attach ourselves to an opinion or belief about something, we limit ourselves, closing doors to all other possibilities. This closing of doors is what I call ignorance. Ignorance is often simply defined as, quote, not knowing. However, as used herein, it is a willful state, the choice to close our hearts and minds to the greater freedom of possibility. If we constantly keep ourselves open, then the shackles of ignorance will never restrain us. What is asked of us is to walk through life with an agnostic mind, accepting our limited perception with humbleness, never forming opinions on what's unknown. And as for what is known, we must always be willing to change our opinion when new information presents itself. Nothing is ever set in stone. We vow to seek understanding in all areas of life, including those areas that make us uncomfortable. Deep breath. And what I find that is often mistaken in this tenet with students and clients of mine over the years is that they often fall into the practice of observing other people's ignorance, and then they judge it. And so they think, well, they don't have to be in ignorance, but interestingly enough, when we're observing another person's ignorance, we're actually limiting our own viewpoints. And so what's fascinating is last night, as the Zen cowboy, I also teach line dancing. So pretty much every time I've taught line dancing at this bar in rural America, I have had negative comments said to me after. Like anytime I'm walking out the bar, there's always some people there that will say something towards me. And of course, I just keep walking because there's no point in engaging in it. And a lot of times it's very silly stuff. And so what's fascinating is, again, it could be for any number of reasons. But at this point, most of the town, because they've read the articles in the newspaper, know that I'm gay. And one of the, more than even the Zen part, the Buddhist religious spiritual part we get judged for is the homophobia that still exists. And so it's fascinating. And I think that's, if we believe that, we come into this life with chosen lessons, again, we don't know for sure. But I would definitely say that choosing to live as a gay man was one of them, because it taught me compassion and the mastery of this tenet early on. Because even before I came out of the closet, this was a huge judgment I always had to face in schools, and then as an adult, and just constantly there has always been that underlying prejudice that I've had to deal with, especially moving here. It was completely reawoken. But at the end of the day, what's fascinating is I never think for once, oh, those people are ignorant. That is never, never, never a thought that crosses my mind. What crosses my mind is, am I having a judgment about them, and how is that ignorant? Really hear that. I don't think, oh, they're ignorant. I think, am I having a judgment in response to their reactions towards me? And how might I be being ignorant towards them? Because if I judge them for judging me, then what I'm doing is equally what they're doing, and I'm falling into the trap of limited perception. And what I recognize is that at the end of the day, that is just a small percentage of who they are and their identity, and they're just saying something in response to a thought that they're having about me, and that's not who they are. And that's how I've built bridges with people from all walks of life over the past 10, 15 years. And it's been this beautiful bridge building experiment of completely suspending all views and all judgments and all biases and all prejudices, because every single person in this room and listening at home, I don't doubt that because you're listening to my sermon, you probably pride yourself a little bit with being an open-minded person and accepting. But the funny thing is that the moment that you're caught up against someone that you judge as closed-minded or having a belief that's different than yours, you become just like the thing that you're judging, and you close your mind off to them. And all you start to see is the label of, maybe it's a political label or a religious label, or even just, it could be a cultural label, or just an emotional label, or just a mental label of, ooh, they're ignorant. They should be learned. And I will do it for them. No, that never works out, does it, when you try to educate them? But what's interesting is when you actually, it's not in every circumstance, but when you take the time to befriend them, that's generally what builds those bridges. And that's the beautiful, beautiful thing. And again, I've done that many times over throughout these past 10, 15 years, is anytime people have judged me, especially if it's in a setting that I can't get away from. Like if I'm walking away from someone at the bar, that's not the setting. But if you're in a class, or if you're in a work environment, or if you're in any place where you have to continually interact with that person, I'm the individual that goes up and says, hey, tell me about your life. I understand that you don't like that I'm gay, and I really don't, that doesn't bother me, and that's okay. But I'd like to get to know you a little bit more. And the fascinating thing is that compassion like that dissolves ignorance, and understanding dissolves ignorance. And the only way that we can get to understanding each other is if we start to suspend our projections of what we think is right and how people should be behaving. Because if you have an idea of how you think people should be behaving, you are caught up in a dualistic mentality of right, wrong, good, bad. And unfortunately, you can be as nice of a happy person as possible, but when you're actually met with those circumstances, you're going to notice that your heart hardens, and you're going to get upset, frustrated, and really turned off by them, by the world, by a religion, by a political group. And again, you can have your preferences. We have our preferences, but at the end of the day, those preferences aren't what's going to build bridges. It's being able to look beyond your viewpoints, being able to fully see the individual and their pain for who they are. Take a breath. I invite you to take a breath. Yes.
So you don't go up and engage with them, and you're walking away like you did last night. Where does your mind go? Do you just send them love and light and move forward?
So the question was, if for those of you who weren't able to hear it, is what do I do, for example, if I'm just walking away from that experience of being, what's the opposite word of cat call? Because it wasn't a cat call, but it was something. I don't know. It was some type of call. Where does my mind go? Honestly, I didn't think twice about it. Like it was just an empty-mindedness, and I moved on. Because again, I'm not attached to it. When you're attached to it, you keep thinking about it. And then you're caught up in the right, the wrong, the good, the bad of it. But when you just accept the experience as the experience, and you just recognize that, that's where they're at, and that's okay. And then I got in the car, and then I started thinking about how joyous the line dancing class was. Most people in that situation probably would then drive home with a bad taste in their mouth and just say, man, I had such a great class, but then this happened. And that just really put the not great cherry on top. And then you think of the negative, the 1% negative versus the 99% positive. And so that's the answer there. And maybe, for example, let's pretend I was still working on that, and I wasn't fully at peace with it just yet. My mind, rather than judging them, would go towards, ooh, this is a trigger for me. I noticed that I feel that negative emotion in me. So how can I hold space for them and not judge them? And realize that by me suspending my belief of them being wrong or bad people, and realizing that there is so much more to their story than that one experience, I can start to soften my judgment, soften the negative feeling, soften the negative feeling. Let's take a breath. It takes time, it takes practice, that's for sure. So the moment we project any idea onto anyone, we do a great disservice. And again, I could spend a whole sermon talking about negativity and how we're projecting negative thoughts on people. But I actually want to take more of a time and talk about projecting what we think are loving ideas onto people. Because it's often our love and our attachment that causes us to care deeply. And in that caring deeply, we might say and do things that actually are harming. Some of you may have had a parent that said, you know what, you're getting fat, you need to lose some weight. Ever happened to you? Or something about your body type? If that hasn't happened to you, awesome. But for a lot of people, that does. And I remember one time that actually happened to me. I won't say who it was, but I had a family member that hugged me one Sunday after service. And they said, wow, you're getting a bit thick. Oh my. And what's fascinating is even though it might be a factual thing, what's funny is that they're saying this as a means to help you from a place of love because they care about your well-being, and they think that whatever body type is better than another body type, and that they're going to help motivate you. This is definitely very true, especially in some ethnic families, and even Italian. I come from partially an Italian lineage. And so it's just think, boom, spout it out. And that Italian type energy, I know I'm not stigmatizing, I know I'm generalizing, but it kind of gives a nice visual to where when you have families that are just so tight knit, especially those that come from strong cultural influences, you really just say it like it is. And you feel like you're coming from a place of love because you care about your loved one. But what's fascinating is if you say, hey, you're getting a little bit fat, you need to lose some weight, does that feel like love? No. Even though if you try to bring it up to your family member or friend that says that, they're going to say, I just say it because I care about you. That's their response. And they're not going to necessarily understand why that hurt your feelings. And we could spend a whole monologue on why that doesn't have to hurt your feelings and you can unattach from that. But the point of this example is that how often do you not even think about another being's experience, another person's experience, and you just spat out your projection of what you think they need to hear or who you think that they are? That is the issue that I'm talking about here, and that's the ignorance I'm talking about here. We don't realize that that's not the message they need to hear in that moment. The message might be, I'm not going to really go down that rabbit hole, but there's so many messages that could be shared. But if we care about another person's well-being, we can actually sit down and ask them how they're doing versus going into projection mode of saying, hey, I'm noticing this, and I think you should be doing this instead. Anyone ever do that before? Or let's use smoking as an example, because as we know, there's health risks to smoking. And for those of you who've smoked or are currently smoking, I'm sure you've heard it a million times that people have said, you shouldn't be doing this, it's terrible for you. Has it ever worked? No. And that's the fascinating aspect of how we all have views that we think are justified, and we spout them off to the people in our life, especially the ones that we care about. And it does not lead to unification, does it? It leads to feeling of judgment and separation. And so this is why I teach my students so much to relinquish your ideas, relinquish your opinions, relinquish the duality of right, wrong, good, bad. And if you are worried about someone, simply sit down and ask them, hey, I notice emotionally there might be something going on right now, and is there anything I can do for you? Would you like a friend to talk to? And again, there's just, every person's a bit different, but what we want to do in that situation is we just really want to open up without an agenda. Because here's what happens is we have an agenda of what we think is right or what we think is wrong, and that we want to get that point across to them. And what that does is it completely stops us from hearing the other person. And it just evaporates any understanding that could be taking place. And that is, I think, maybe potentially I really got this early on, is because the mass majority of my work, even beyond pastorship, is life coaching. And so in life coaching and all the type of therapy work I've held space for with people is like, you don't know who the hell's going to sit on that couch. And if you go into it with a preconceived idea, or if you have your own judgments, think about this. I have worked with people who have been sexually abused. I've also worked with people who've done the sexual abuse. That's some heavy stuff to hold space for. And if you have an idea of what is right and what is wrong in that moment, you are completely limiting the ability to connect with that individual, because everyone is deserving of peace, no matter the things that they have done. You might disagree with that, but think about that for a moment. Everyone is deserving of peace, no matter the things that they have done, no matter the crimes that they have done. And a lot of people want them to be punished. But if you punish them, then they remain out of alignment. And if they're out of alignment, they're going to do more things that are out of alignment. So in actuality, we don't want to get caught up in this punishment mentality. We want to suspend that punishment reward system. And we want to say, my mission, my goal is to not only embody peace, but anytime I'm interacting with other people and that they're interested in peace, is to help them achieve peace as well, not worrying about whether or not they're worthy of it. Because the more people that return to peace, the less harm that is going to be committed. So again, really think about the most atrocious crimes that have been committed, and we want to get attached to the idea that they deserve punishment. But even that right, wrong, that good, bad, that dualistic punishment reward system keeps them in the suffering. And that is what caused the crime in the first place. And I think I brought this up last time we talked about this tenet, where someone asked Abraham Hicks if someone was like Hitler was in heaven. And the person was saying, hey, is Hitler in heaven? And then Abraham Hicks's response, and again, this is more metaphysical, spiritual, but it's a great analogy. Abraham Hicks's response was, of course, once you die, you just join the galactic soup. Everyone's in the galactic soup. Everyone rejoins in alignment. What a beautiful thing. And the person didn't like that response because they wanted Hitler to suffer. And then Abraham Hicks said, why would you want someone that caused some of the most pain on earth to remain in suffering? Because it was from his suffering that led to all of this pain. So what you really want to be saying is that I want Hitler to realign with alignment, to realign with peace, to realign with well-being. And so thank goodness he's in heaven. Thank goodness he joined the galactic soup. But again, our ego says, no, someone did X, Y, Z, they need to be punished. Now that was a macro example. Let's bring it down to a micro, back to your relationships and your family dynamics. Because again, we could talk about the macro all day long, but that doesn't really help us. What helps us is to see how we apply this in the day-to-day living. Normally, relationships, couple dynamics don't get along because they want their partner to suffer a little bit. Let's really be honest. You know, I've worked with couples and they say they want to work things out, but really what they're saying, like we joked previously, is that they just want to be justified as right and that their partner is wrong. And so what's fascinating is if you find yourself in a suffering experience with especially relationships, really what you're attached to is not wanting peace. You're actually attached to wanting to stoke that suffering, because you are caught up in the right and the wrong, and you want to be justified by it. You want to be in the right, and you want your partner to be wrong. And as weird as that sounds, that is often what occurs, because if you actually let that go, then you would drop your agenda, and for the first time in possibly your entire marriage, you would sit down, let go of your ego, let go of yourself, and just listen and stop making about you in that moment. You would simply listen to the other person's suffering. You would listen to the other person's suffering and allow a dialogue to take place. But what happens is when our ego gets triggered in our own views of how we were hurt by them, we can't have that dialogue, because instantly when they say, hey, you did this, instantly we go into, well, you did this instead. And so it creates that battle immediately on that couch. Fascinating, isn't it? And what was it? I think we talked about it last week. For those of you, if any of you remember what I talked about last week, it was something along the lines of love is being able to listen to other people's suffering without becoming offended. Love is being able to listen to other people's suffering without being offended. And I would say, you could share a little bit on this too, but this is exactly how we've gotten to a place and started our relationship with such peace and happiness is because anytime one of us is in suffering, even if it's due to another person's actions, our partner's actions, we drop out of ego and into that moment of holding space and listening to our partner's suffering without making it personal, even if it is personal. Does that make sense? One of the most difficult things to do. And that is why we work towards releasing self. We go through the tenets. We have ignorance as an illusion. We have chaos as an illusion. Then we have duality as an illusion. And then we release our attachments to the mundane world. We release our attachments to what we think we know. And then finally, we release our attachments to who we think we are. And if you don't do those 6 things, along with the first 3 things of self-mastery, of thought, impulse, and emotion, I know it's a lot, I'm sorry. Then we're always going to be trapped in our suffering because we're never not going to be offendable. We are never not going to be offendable as long as we are so attached to an identity of who we think we are and what we think is right. But what happens when you let that go just for a moment? You don't have to let that go forever. But if you just let that go in those really critical moments of connecting with another being that is suffering, especially if the suffering is caused by your hand, it changes the dynamic. And it's almost hard to even think about, and even it almost seems impossible because so much of our planet is the exact opposite. But that is our job as these modern monks, holding space for that, and we live it in our marriage, we live it in our community. We do the best of our ability to live it 24/7. Again, we're human, it's not perfect. But that is the goal that we're working on, and why ignorance is an illusion. We seek understanding, because understanding dissolves ignorance. Understanding dissolves ignorance. So let me. Yeah, absolutely.
So you're talking about loving someone as truly listening without being offended.
Yes.
Can you speak to loving someone and truly listening without trying to fix it for them? Because when I do that, it's because I'm uncomfortable with their suffering, and it makes me feel like I'm suffering because they're suffering, so I want to fix it. I mean, I'm not talking about my job. I'm talking about like my personal stuff.
No, this is perfect.
You know?
I get it. And that is so true. You bring up such a valid point that I've talked about years ago, actually. We are such selfish creatures because when we look at the world, we're not looking at individuals as individuals. We're just looking at their pain and how it's making us uncomfortable. Really think about that. When you see pain in the world, you're just like, ooh, that's uncomfortable. Let me cover it up. Let me try and fix it. But we go about it in the way that is our own personal bias and opinion of what we think we would do in that situation, what we think is right. And so we don't even listen to what their needs are. We just say, do this. And it goes back to duality, which fortunately in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking all about that, because this is duality that we talk about. And here, we're not talking about polarity. You know, polarity is like hot, cold, east, west, all that stuff. The duality we speak of in Dunasha, in living peace, is the judgment. And your judgment is that there is something wrong with their suffering. And that's not the case. This is a big, deep teaching, people. You don't have to agree with it right now, but I just invite you to be open to it. To truly hold space for the world, you have to suspend your belief of thinking that there's something wrong with pain and something wrong with suffering. It seems counterintuitive. It really does. But when you can let go of thinking that there's something wrong with their pain and suffering, you actually gain the ability to hold space for them without your bias. I like to say, sometimes the vase is meant to be broken and you don't need to fix it. And that vase breaking leads to something else that we may not even know in the present moment. And it's this beautiful thing. But if you can actually rationalize this slightly. Think about the pain you've gone through in your past, all of you, and how much of it actually led to your awakening. So is pain actually bad? I would say pain is a natural part of life that allows us to soften and awaken, while suffering is just our resistance to the pain. And so our suffering that we attach to pain, yes, suffering, self-chosen, because we are so holding on to it. It's kind of like how last week we talked about sadness with acceptance equals appreciation, while sadness with resistance equals grief. Sadness with acceptance leads to appreciation. Sadness with resistance equals grief. Powerful shit, isn't it? And again, that's the fascinating thing, is that if you add resistance to like any emotion, you're going to notice a psychological response to that in your being. But when you bring out acceptance into those emotions, even if they're not the happiest emotion, you're going to notice that it's going to lead to something beautiful. It's going to lead to a softening. It's going to lead to a realization. And again, this is some difficult stuff to do, but that's why we have all these services and community gatherings, so that we come together and we practice. And I was thinking about this while I was getting ready today. I love conflict. What? No, I really do. Because I don't view it as wrong. I think conflict sometimes is a beautiful catalyst for awakening something that we didn't realize was still within us. So when you have conflict, especially in a relationship, and then we lose our shit, don't lose your shit. It's okay, keep it. You don't need to freak out and say something's wrong. You could say, oh my gosh, there's a trigger here. I just found something new that bothers me. How exciting. How exciting. I did not know that this was still here. I'm sorry, I did not know this was happening. But now let's talk about it. We can talk. Yeah, I do.
He does this in our marriage.
Oh my gosh. I get so excited when there's like something out of alignment. I'm like, oh my gosh, something to work on. Yes. So when you get angry, when you get upset, it's okay. Don't squash it down. Say, wow, this is information that I can use. And let's come together and talk about this from a place of gentle curiosity. Let's talk about this from a place of gentle curiosity. But when you get offended, ego takes over and nothing happens. It just perpetuates it. But when you can suspend your beliefs of what is right, wrong, good, bad, the other person, blah, 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 they hurt me, F you, that doesn't help things. And so we take a step back, we meditate for a bit, we calm ourselves down, and then we return to the conversation and we just say something like, I just want to let you know that I'm struggling right now and I'm suffering emotionally. And I don't want to blame you for this, but I know that I'm responsible for my emotional well-being, but I just want to let you know that I am in pain. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to listen to me and just really hold space for me in this moment. And then I'll listen to you, whatever you have to share. And let's try to come together with a solution here. But we don't do that, do we? No. We say, curse word followed by, you hurt me. Or we try to start with it, but then we notice our partner is being stagnant around it. Then it pisses us off, and then we escalate our voice because you're not listening. So excerpt from Living Peace, pages 95 to 96. Some people have the confused idea that peace can only occur when all the colors on a palette are the same. The actuality of peace is accepting each color's differences and seeing the beauty each possesses. Peace is the freedom that comes from individuality and co-creativity that arises from cooperation. When you are red and at peace, you can appreciate blue and not need it to become red like you, and vice versa. The color not at peace wants all the colors to be like it so that it can experience peace. Think about that. We want, when we are not at peace within ourselves, we think that, well, once all the colors are the same, then we'll be at peace. But unfortunately, that's not how this life works. It will never work that way. And that's why we see a lot of politics and religions try to create everyone the same color. While here in Dunasha, we have our teachings on inner peace, but they can apply to any religion, really. And so what we're interested in is being a bridge between religion. Nothing more than that. We're a bridge between religion. We have these teachings that can help you achieve inner peace, but we're not teaching you dogma. We're not teaching you, all these things that are set in stone. We're actually teaching you, it sounds weird, but to doubt, to question. Doubt's a strong word, just to question things consistently, especially when it relates to your own emotions. If you're at peace, cool. If you're not, if you're noticing things are within you, that's the thing to question. Let's take a breath. So Thich Nhat Hanh, I was going to go into this, but I'll go into it Wednesday. He has a really, really cool chapter on how in a single piece of paper the whole universe exists. And I will explain that on Wednesday, and it will blow your mind. But he does say something along the lines of, if you don't understand your partner, you don't understand someone, it's not love. It's something else. If you don't have understanding in the way that you're loving someone, it is not love. It's something else. And I think that's true, because I think of the times back where I thought I was in love, or I thought I was loving people, but truly I was loving an idea of that person and not actually who they were. I didn't really understand their pain or their suffering because I was trying to fix it. And so it doesn't mean that we're not in love. It doesn't mean that we're not in love with people continuously, such as our family. But in that moment, it means that we're not in love. We're not in the loving vibration when we're not practicing understanding. And so at the end of the day, I invite you all to really take away from today's sermon this understanding that it is so important to release your viewpoints. Because if you get caught up in any viewpoint, it could even be this stuff. What you're doing is you're falling in dogma. Dogma is not strictly religious. Dogma is anything that you strongly hold as right. And the moment you do that, you're limiting your ability to actually see an individual for their individual self, because you're seeing your perception of what they're doing or not doing. And unfortunately, that is not how you build bridges. How you build bridges is suspending your views, holding space, showing up, and listening. Gentle curiosity, compassion, loving kindness, respect. Fascinating things. And I'll conclude with saying, let me take a breath. I want to see if I can kind of bring it home. Something Thich Nhat Hanh also says is how knowledge can actually get in the way. Knowledge of what we think we know really gets in the way of this stuff. And that's why when actually this phrase came to me recently, living wisdom. You know, we're living the wisdom. We're living peace. We are living happiness rather than analyzing it and trying to necessarily teach it. And so a revow I made myself this weekend actually was to worry less about teaching it. Granted, I have to talk about it. You know, it's like, hello. It helps, but it's not the main thing. My main purpose is to return to my happiness, return to my peace, and share it in the community, such as even in line dancing. I guarantee there are individuals out there who are more knowledgeable than me in the teachings, and they would even say, Alaric, you know, you're this modern monk and you're a spiritual teacher, you're a pastor, you should not be in a bar and teaching line dancing to drunk women. A few of them. And supporting that type of energy and playing songs that are not peaceful. Some of the songs have some interesting words in them. And I actually was judged by that very early on, even from one of my mentors. And my belief is that it's about cultivating connection and happiness. And it doesn't matter what it looks like. Because if you were there last night, you would just see the joy exuding from everyone who was participating. And that is what this life is about. Cultivating that happiness through community, however it looks. Cultivating our inner peace through the teachings. And of course, cultivating loving kindness towards every interaction we have. That is living wisdom. So your practice is not to have your nose in a book. Your practice is, how are you showing up in your daily life, in all of your interactions, and how are you showing up internally with your inner working of your mind, and if there's inner peace there or not. Deep breath. And thank you. So, thank you all for joining us if you've made it this far. Links are down below for anyone who wants to donate. And I do recommend, if you've been watching all of these videos and you're getting some awesome juiciness, deliciousness, and insight from this, please consider donating even just a small amount, because it really makes a difference. Our center here our community, our church, you know, it is sustained by donations like yours. So we thank you. And as always, I'm always open for one-on-one sessions, even long distance. So we'll see you next week. You're welcome.